Have you ever taken a picture that's just completely blown out or maybe way too dark? Today we're going to learn all about exposure and how to solve that problem. Welcome to a Photography Simplified video where I do my best to simplify photography for you with the goal of helping you to get out and take great photos. Today we're covering exposure. Exposure refers to the lighting of your image. Basically, how well the scene was lit that you captured. A scene could be correctly exposed, meaning it's very true to what the naked eye saw. It could be overexposed, meaning it's just way too bright, that it's washed out, and the bright areas of the photo are just a bright white and hard to see any detail in. Or in contrast, a photo could be underexposed, meaning that it's way too dark, that the darker areas of the photo are just pitch black and all the shadows are very deep and it's hard to see detail in the dark areas of the photo. We want our photos to be correctly exposed. We want them to look like what the scene was in reality when we captured it. Let's look at some example photos. First, here is a scene that is overexposed. The sky is too bright. You can see that the brightest areas in the clouds are completely washed out and a very bright white. It's hard to see the detail in those areas. Now, let's look at the same scene underexposed. In this underexposed image, we can see that only the brightest areas of the sky are really visible and everything else is mostly pitch black or a very dark shadow, and it's hard to get detail back from this image as well. Last, here's the scene correctly exposed. We can see the sky well, and the highlights in the sky, as well as the foreground, which is darker. A correctly exposed image will be easier to process, edit, and turn into a final work of art. You might be wondering what is so bad about an over or underexposed image. Outside of the obvious, it may not look very pleasing to the eye. Well, when you go to edit an over or underexposed image, you'll run into a lot more difficulty trying to make the image look more true to how it was than if you were to expose the scene correctly straight from the get-go. Let's look at some examples.
These examples are nothing particularly great, just a local area at sunset time, but they will help to illustrate why an overexposed or an underexposed image can be bad. This first example image is an overexposed image. You can see that the sky is pretty bright and that the brightest areas seem to be blown out. If you are using Lightroom, you can use the keyboard shortcut J to show what's called clipping. In this case, this shows me all of the highlights that are being clipped or that are completely overexposed. Now, part of the reason that it's bad to have an overexposed image is you can see as I move the exposure slider to try and compensate for the brightness, that I can only recover to an extent this image. Those brightest areas that were blown out are still there and I'm not able to completely darken them. This is why you don't want an overexposed image. The data is lost in those brightest areas and there's no way to really get it back. In contrast, let's look at an underexposed image. In an underexposed image, we have the opposite problem. You can see that the foreground here is extremely dark. Once again, if I hit the keyboard shortcut J, I can see all of these dark spots are being clipped and we're losing that data. So even if I tried to fix this photo by brightening it up as much as I can see that it does come back, but we end up having another issue. It becomes very grainy, and this makes the image look of poorer quality and not as pleasing to the eye. It also makes it softer and not as crisp. And so this is why we don't want underexposed images. Now, in contrast, here's a correctly exposed image. This gives us a lot of room to play with. I can darken the exposure and, fix that sky, or I can bring it up and get a lot of light back in the foreground, but we don't have that same issue of the graininess. Last, I want to show what you could get if you are editing a properly exposed photo. Here is an end result of an edit I did at this location. Using the properly exposed photo, I was able to really bring out the detail in the sky and the colors, as well as brighten up that foreground. And we don't have any of the issues where the sky has areas that are just completely blown out or white, and we don't have that graininess because we tried to brighten up an image that was too dark.
If you're finding this video helpful so far, please consider giving me a like and subscribing if you want to see future videos. I'll have more videos coming out covering beginner topics such as this. If you want to get your exposure correctly, you're in luck. There are some tools that can help you. And one of the biggest things that you can use is called a histogram. A histogram is basically a graphical representation of the light in your image. The y-axis of a histogram represents the number of pixels. The x-axis represents the brightness of those pixels. And so from left to right, the pixels will be either darker to brighter. This means that the three sections of a histogram can be divided into the shadows, the midtones, and highlights. Wherever you see a big increase in your histogram, that just means that more of your photo falls within that group. Maybe there's more shadows, more highlights, however the scene that you captured may be. So the far left of the histogram, if you think of it in kind of three separate columns, that first section represents the shadows or the darker areas of your image. The middle section represents the midtones in your image, and the far right section represents the highlights in the image. Looking at this histogram, we can see that everything is squished over far on the left, meaning there are a lot of shadows or dark areas in this image. And because it's squished all the way against the side, this is what a histogram may look like for a photo that is underexposed. Now looking at this histogram, we can see that the opposite is happening. Everything is squished all the way over to the right, meaning there are a lot of highlights or bright areas within this photo. And this photo, because it's squished all the way onto that side and spiking in the highlights section, would be a histogram of a photo that may be overexposed. Now, what we would want is a correctly exposed photo, where none of the pixels are either too bright or too dark, where nothing is squished against that far right side or squished against the far left side. So a histogram that looks like this may represent a photo that is correctly exposed. As a summary of what we just covered, here is an example of a over, under, and correctly exposed image and what those histograms may end up looking like. Now, let's look at some examples using the camera of how to use the histogram to expose our scenes correctly. Okay, we want to look at some of the tools on your camera to help you to get the exposure right. The first thing is, on most cameras, after taking a picture, you can review it to see if it was exposed correctly. In this case, I have a scene here set up with some flowers as well as a camera, and so there's a little bit of different things. There's darker colors, lighter colors, and some reflective surfaces. So this should hopefully be a good example of getting the exposure right. So I'm just going to go ahead and take a picture, how I have it set up. Now with my Canon camera, I can hit this little play button to review. And then if I toggle using this info button, I can turn on the histogram, and I can now see, okay, nothing is squished all the way over to the right, so I didn't blow out my highlights. Nothing is squished all the way to the left, so I didn't blow out my shadows. So after you take your photos, this is a great way to review them and see how you did as far as exposing it correctly. Being able to review your scene after you take an image to make sure you exposed it correctly is great. However, one thing I prefer to do instead is most cameras let you shoot in live view, which is what I'm doing right now. So you can see the picture I'm going to take. Typically, you would see something maybe like this, your camera settings. If you're on a Canon camera, like mine, I just hit this start stop button here with this little icon of the white camera. That lets me shoot in live view. Now, the cool thing about live view is if I'm in camera mode like I am right now, manual mode, where I can change the settings, I can hit this info. Now all those settings came up that I can change, and I can hit it again and more things pop up, and I can get the histogram to pop up. So this will change as I adjust my camera settings. So let's say, for instance, that I adjust this, and you can see that's kind of making it blown out. Now you can see how that histogram has changed. So if you were in the field taking a picture and adjusting things, you could see, oh, I'm totally blowing out my highlights. So let's say you adjust it and just for example's sake, let's say I go too far the other way. Now I can look at it. Okay, this is way too underexposed. It's very dark. So you can play with this until you get the image to look correct and kind of where you want it. And once you do, then you can check your histogram as the failsafe to say, okay, am I blowing out highlights? Am I blowing out the shadows? No, this looks good. And you can take your image and get it exposed well. Now I have another scene set up here with this antique camera. You may be wondering, okay, when I'm looking at the histogram, how do I know what is best? It may be easy to tell when something's completely blown out or completely underexposed, but what about in between? Or how do I know when a photo is exposed right? Typically, what people recommend is ETTR, which stands for exposed to the right. So let's say I am completely underexposing this photo. And so I go to fix it. Here, nothing is touching. However, everything's mostly in the middle and the far left. So exposed to the right, well, it suggests that I'm going to kind of bring up those values. Now it's much more towards the right. And let's take this photo. That is our end result. And I'll put the final image unedited on screen for you to see. But typically when taking a photo, if you're wondering, where do I put my histogram, exposed to the right is what is commonly suggested. If this video is helpful for you and you'd like more information on beginner topics in photography, check out my book, Photography Simplified.
If you would like a visual beginner's guide to photography, check out my book, Photography Simplified, available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. The book covers topics including exposure and the exposure triangle, sharpness and focus, gear, composition, editing, and more. It even includes a list of beginner tips. There are helpful graphics to explain each of the topics that are covered in the book. I've put a lot of work into this book to include everything I wish I could have known when I started out. If you think the book could be helpful to you and haven't already, check the link in the description for more information.
Outside of using the histogram, there are 3 main settings that you can use to adjust the exposure when taking a photo. They are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These 3 elements make up the exposure triangle. I'll have a separate video on each of the elements and on the exposure triangle, helping to walk you through it and explain how these things can help you to expose your photos correctly. For now, all you need to know is that these are other ways that you can adjust the exposure of your image is by modifying these settings. The aperture is basically how much light you're letting in to the camera. The shutter speed is how long you're allowing the camera to capture light, and the ISO is just the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. Last, there are 2 tools that I want to cover that you can use to get your exposure right. The first is called exposure compensation, which you'll use if you're shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority, which are specific camera modes. Let's show what exposure compensation looks like using the camera. There may be instances where you're shooting in a specific camera mode because you're trying to get a certain desired effect. Maybe you want to freeze motion or blur motion, or maybe you want a certain depth of field. And I'll cover in a later video those different effects and camera modes and how to get them. But what you need to know in this video is that let's say you're in one of those camera modes, you have your settings exactly how you want them to get one of those effects. Maybe you're trying to freeze motion or blur it, but the exposure still isn't quite what you want it. You can use the exposure compensation tool, which is this little scale right here. I can tell it to compensate either by decreasing the exposure or increasing it. And what this will do is it'll keep my camera settings the same, but it will either make the photo darker or lighter, just trying to compensate a little bit. If you're not shooting in live view, it would look something like this. You'd have the scale here on my Canon camera, and I can click into it, and then I can tell it, either brighter or darker. And that is exposure compensation. The last tool that I want to show you is called the EV meter, which looks very similar to exposure compensation. However, it's just a scale letting you know if you're under or overexposing an image. Let's take a look at what that looks like using the camera as well. If you're shooting in manual mode, for instance, and your settings aren't quite right, let's say you're overexposing the image like I am in this case. It's very blown out. You can see my histogram is very overexposed. This little meter right here is the EV meter, and that will help you to know when you are over or underexposing something. So if I go to push the shutter button to take the photo, you can see this little indicator popping up right here, indicating that I am overexposed that much. So let's say I change these settings now to try and fix it a little bit, and I go to take the photo again. You can see I'm still a little overexposed is what the camera is telling me, but it is better. So as you adjust settings, this will also help you to get the exposure that you need. It may take some extra time to do things like checking your EV meter at the bottom, or turning on the exposure compensation, or even using the histogram. But these extra steps really pay off in the end. If you can expose the photo correctly in camera, you're going to have that much better of a end result. It'll be easier to edit the photo and produce the type of image you're looking for. The last tool that I want to mention, which most cameras nowadays have, some people call them blinkies, but in my Canon camera, if I go into the settings, I can turn on what's called the exposure warning. And so let's say I overexpose my image. In this case, I'm going to turn it, purposely overexposed like this. I'm going to take this image. What it will do is when I go to review the image, it will be blinking in the areas that I've overexposed. So now if I hit the review, you can see all of that background, all of this foreground, and these areas that are blinking are areas I've overexposed. This is a helpful tool because in this case, I've clearly exposed the whole image. But let's say that I only barely overexpose it, just maybe a certain area. Let's see what this looks like. Those little blinkies will help me to know what areas I may have blown out that are often hard to see with our eyes. You can see here, there's some pieces on the camera here, up here, and then here, this reflection on the tile. So if I were photographing a sunset, for instance, these little blinkies would help me to know, certain clouds that may be getting blown out. And then I can adjust my settings just a little bit to make sure the whole image is exposed correctly. Hopefully this video has helped you to understand exposure better and enabled you to go out and expose the scenes that you're capturing correctly. In next week's video, we'll be covering aperture and diving deeper into what it is and how it affects exposure as well. We'll see you in the next one.